What do Ja Morant, Colin Kaepernick, and Ralph Cifaretto all have in common? Well, there's an old rule of thumb that says drama can't exceed productivity. In other words, if you are a high performer, people will tolerate your BS as long as you remain a high performer. But as soon as your productivity falls off, you aren't going to be tolerated for long. It isn't uncommon for a sports superstar to get away with things no other player would be allowed to. This isn't just confined to sports either. We see it in politics, Hollywood, and just about every other facet of life. People who are misbehaved high performers are always cut slack. That is, until they start to fall off. Eventually, what happens is these high-performing drama queens roll the dice for too long and things finally catch up to them. It typically happens when they can't perform at the high level they once did, but still maintain their foolishness, or they do something so egregious that their behavior can't be ignored anymore. This is the story of Ralph Cifaretto. He's a top earner and a rising star in the family, but he's also a pain in the ass, disloyal, and not too keen on showing respect to anyone. Most comments online about Ralph regard him as despicable and evil, and while those things are obviously true compared to others in the show, there are others just as evil, if not more than he is, but they tend to get a pass because they're quote-unquote more likable. Unlike someone like, let's say, Silvio, Ralph is meant to be someone we dislike from the start. Everything about him screams obnoxious. We first meet him after Tony's mother's passing at the Soprano household. Ralph's entrance is very different from the other mobsters, which immediately sets him apart from the rest of them. The first thing we notice about Ralph is that he's much better dressed than those around him, and he's not afraid to openly cry and show vulnerability. He is visibly upset over the loss of Tony's mother and refers to the passing of his own mother a year earlier. His emotions seem genuine, and in a world where crying is frowned upon, he doesn't seem too concerned with how his open emotions will make him look in front of others. Immediately after this, the group goes to the backyard and Ralph changes his demeanor into the person we all know him to be, snarky and disrespectful. Gone is the crying mess, saddened by the death of Tony's mother, and in comes the guy who consistently lets his mouth get him into trouble. In this scene, Ralph and Tony set the stage for what their relationship is like throughout the show. Ralph initially tries to disarm Tony by pretending to empathize with him, then puts himself in a position of authority, which he does not have, followed by an argument between the two of them. Interestingly, we also see that Tony tends to react to Ralph's disrespect differently than he does when others disrespect him. Whenever Ralph does show disrespect, Tony simply corrects the situation and then he moves on. Early on, Tony seems more annoyed with Ralph than anything, like he's stuck dealing with an obnoxious little brother. For instance, remember the time when Ralph was late to the sit-down and then made fun of Paulie for being stupid and believing in a flying saucer, to which Tony just warns him to shut up and that he's not going to tell him to shut up again. When in the hospital after Vito's brother is attacked, Ralph openly disrespects Gigi, who confronts him, but Tony just tells Gigi, not now. Finally, when Ralph hits Georgie with a chain, Tony again doesn't seem angry. He seems annoyed that his night has been interrupted and he's having to deal with a misbehaved child, as he simply tells Ralph to take Georgie to the ER. Up until Ralph kills Tracy, there really isn't any serious conflict between him and Tony. After that incident, however, it's all downhill for Ralph, and unfortunately for him, it's entirely his own fault. Ralph's killing of Tracy moves him from someone who is treated as an annoyance to a legitimate problem for Tony. But like most things involving Ralph, it never needed to happen in the first place. Ralph's worst enemy was his mouth. He just couldn't keep it shut. As Christopher says, loose lips sink ships. And Ralph's mouth caused major chaos and eventually cost him his life. Take for instance the number of times Ralph ran his mouth for no reason other than the fact that he just couldn't help himself. After Brian Spatafora lands in the hospital after being assaulted by Mustang Sally, Ralph doesn't just openly insult Vito and Brian, he also insults Gigi to his face by referring to him as Lee Iacocca, all right in front of Tony with no repercussions. He also insults Paulie by calling him stupid forever at a sit-down to discuss the payout from a previous heist. Later, when dealing with the fallout from the Ginny Sack joke, Ralph once again runs his mouth by sarcastically calling Johnny Sir Walter Raleigh. Despite his mouth causing all his problems, Ralph never does learn his lesson, and eventually it gets him killed. In some ways, Ralph was a monster of Tony's own making. He openly acknowledges how good of an earner Ralph is, but leaves Ralph in a position where he can cause problems, and doesn't give Ralph the one thing he's always wanted, which is to be captain. When he finally does bump Ralph up to captain, he does it in a way that mocks Ralph's previous decision not to have a drink with him.
Not just 'cause somebody was constipated and blew a gasket.
You're gonna be making a lot more money, Ralphie. So don't question. You want a captain? You're captain.
So, we gonna have a drink together or what?
Now, it may seem that Tony was justified in giving Ralph a bit of his own medicine, but Tony is the boss and should have realized what slighting someone like Ralph would do. Tony had just seen the damage Ralph had caused just within the crew he was in. As a captain, he'd have much more impact on the family as a whole, and Tony just slighted him instead of giving him the promotion, showing his support, and moving on. Remember, Tony had previously told Ralph the reason he didn't originally promote Ralph was because he had some bad tendencies, which included bad decisions because of his impulsiveness. As with many instances, Tony punishes, or at the very least, inhibits others despite him doing the same things. Additionally, we see over time that Tony consistently takes money out of Ralph's pockets from Pio Mai's earnings, but additionally demands Ralph pay for things such as titanium horseshoes. Even when discussing Carmine's decision to take out Johnny Sack over the Ginny Sack joke, Tony, Silvio, and Christopher all deny mocking Ginny Sack to the extent Ralph did, which again is a lie. As is the pattern with Tony throughout the show, his own decisions and hypocritical treatment of those under him lead to them holding grudges. Had Tony treated Ralph differently, he may not have had as many issues with him, at least for a while. While Silvio mentions that Ralph is a loose cannon and might try to kill Tony one day, there's not a lot of evidence that Ralph was looking to take him out. Sure, after Tony hits him, Ralph vents to Johnny Sack and says Tony is going down, but it seems like he was blowing off steam more than seriously wanting to plan a hit. If anything, it seems like Ralph was more upset his ego was damaged. In that same conversation when Silvio and Tony are discussing Ralph, even Silvio admits he's a bit surprised by how Tony reacted. Silvio misquote the rules for Tony, which ironically Tony tells Paulie to do after he disparages Ralph. Had Tony tried to make things right with Ralph and not done it with such contempt, he could have gained an ally instead of someone who begrudges him. The thing about Ralph that made him so dangerous, though, wasn't his ability to earn or run his mouth, it was the ability to create conflict within the family. Ralph is an instigator. He can get people riled up to the point where even if they don't like him, they're forced to respond to his actions. As Junior points out to Tony, Ralph has been a toxic member of the April crew by undermining Gigi and pissing in the ears of the rest of the crew, which could lead to a mutiny. Ralph's annoying behaviors at the Bada Bing were enough for people to not want to be around him, but his violent and brutal attack on Tracy caused people to pick sides. Of course, the members of his crew backed him up, and as mentioned before, even Silvio sided with Ralph simply based on the facts of the situation. Even after his death, when Silvio, Patsy, and Albert were speculating about Ralph's death, Albert tells Patsy that even though he doesn't like Ralph, the fact that he might have been killed over a horse caused him to question Tony, and that if Silvio knew the truth, he'd be the first to pull Tony's plug. Think about how the other members of the family would perceive their own status when a top-earning guy like Ralph can't even get a promotion, but someone like Gigi, who is an outsider, can. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence that they'll be rewarded for contributing. We see an example of this later when Tony is berating the captains for a lack of growth in income, and all of them have nothing to offer but flimsy excuses. Ralph is even able to disrupt things with New York that causes tension that spills over after he's gone. Back when they were still friends, Ralph asks Johnny Sack if he can join the New York family, to which Johnny blatantly tells him no, and that the boss, Carmine Sr., doesn't know who he is. However, when Johnny asks Carmine Sr. to sanction a hit on Ralph, Carmine tells Johnny that the family depends on Ralph and they couldn't afford to lose him. Tony tells Christopher that he knew back then, by not siding with Johnny against Ralph, it would be a problem for Carmine down the road and would come back to haunt him. There was a comment on a YouTube clip that I think is a great description of Ralph, and that is, he's a dark reflection of Tony. In some ways, they're very much alike. They're both very manipulative, they're both serial womanizers, and they both have times where they display compassion and genuine care for people around them, in addition to their violent outbursts and lack of self-control. When Christopher gets his promotion to capo of Paulie's crew, Ralph genuinely seems happy for him. He also seems like he does try to mentor Jackie Jr. as best as he can, despite his misguided attempts to do so. He takes him out to dinner, gives him a gun, and tells him his money is no good, and shares stories of his past as an up-and-coming made man back in the day. This, of course, leads to disastrous results, but it appears that the attempts to bond with Jackie Jr. were genuine. Later, when his son Justin is injured, Ralph becomes a mess and it's evident how much he loves and cares for his son. He even goes to meet with the priest to seek understanding and guidance and attempts to reconcile with Rosalie. This human side of Ralph made him more likable, with even Tony and Christopher stepping up to defend him against Paulie. All of these things made Ralph extremely influential in and out of the New Jersey family. When the boss of a New York family refuses to take him out at the request of his underboss, that's a lot of influence. One of Ralph's biggest weakness is, even though he is a very witty person, he makes some incredibly boneheaded decisions that seem to defy logic. In other words, he thinks he's smarter than he really is. Upon Ralph's return from Florida, Tony asks Ralph if he knew who had been spilling secrets to New York. As he is talking to Tony, Ralph plays it off and acts like he has no idea what Tony is talking about, and doesn't cave even when Tony says, "Come on, Ralph, I was there." But even then, he doesn't budge. This seems to let Tony know that if Ralph was going to hold the line in front of him, he would also hold it with Johnny. So what does Ralph do? Everything he wasn't supposed to. There was no reason Ralph decided to apologize, especially after he clearly didn't want to, and Tony explicitly told him not to. He simply could have held the line and just waited things out. Once he pieced together that it was little Paulie who told Paulie about the joke, he could have taken that information and done something productive with it. Instead, he decides to prank call Paulie's mother, and while we can all agree the prank call was a great scene, it didn't accomplish anything to help his situation with Johnny. Another scene that really made me question Ralph's intelligence was his approach to dealing with the Native American protests. You can almost see where this is going based on how Tony reacts when Silvio tells him that him and Ralphie are working on a few things. You just know it's going to be a train wreck, and it basically is. Ralph's genius idea is to tell Del Clay that an actor who is big in Native American cinema is not really a Native American. I remember watching that scene and thinking, that was your big plan? Of course, the plan does backfire, and it just ends up making things worse for Tony. Then we have the scene where Tony kills Ralph. Tony seemed to know from the start that Ralph had killed Pyomai, but just like he did in other situations, Tony tries to get the truth straight from the person, just like he did with Paulie on the boat in Miami. At first, Ralph plays it off and Tony doesn't make a move, but then Ralph does what Ralph always did. He opens his mouth and made things worse. Tony doesn't attack Ralph until he says, "What are you, a vegetarian? You eat beef and pork by the carload." This triggered Tony's rage and he unleashed his desire for vengeance, not just for Pyomai, but also for Tracy. This is similar to the time at the Bada Bing when Ralph rhetorically asks, who does he think he is, Sir Walter Raleigh? This extra commentary caused a violent reaction just as it did in his house, except that this time, Tony wasn't trying to save his life, he was trying to kill him. Finally, we have the scene after Jackie Jr. and his crew rob the card game and Ralph and Tony discuss what to do. I'll admit the first few times I watched this scene when I was younger, I didn't catch on to what was really happening in this conversation. I just thought it was weird how nice they were being to each other and how remorseful they both sounded. I figured it was because they were both disappointed and unsure what to do. As time went on, however, I realized this was anything but two guys coming to terms. This was two guys playing chess to determine who would take the blame and who would deal out punishment. This is a conversation full of subtle hints. Here's what's really being said in this conversation.
I know how close you are to the family.
Translation: this should be your call. This is your best friend's kid.
I feel for you. You're living under the same roof.
Translation: oh no, you're not putting this on me. Don't try to pull that close to the family bullshit on me when you're the one living there.
I know it was my card game.
Translation: yeah, maybe you got a point there.
But tell you the truth, Tony, I want to give the kid a pass.
Fine, I'm gonna be the nice guy and show mercy, just like my hero Maximus.
Yeah?
Are you serious?
It's just me, though. I know you got bigger concerns. You're the boss, and I'll make sure your orders are done, whatever they may be.
Well, you're the boss. You make the decision to kill your best friend's kid.
Well, I think you should go with your instincts on this, Ralph.
This is your problem, and you're going to deal with it.
But Furio took a hit. Chris, these are made men.
If you're not the one to order the hit, it's gonna make you look weak.
Well, make sure they respect your decision. Because I'm sure you're going to do the right thing. That's why I made you captain.
If you don't take this kid out, everyone, including me, will know openly how much of a punk you are. If you're a captain and can't do what you're supposed to, there's no reason for you to be here.
This is Rosalie's kid.
This is Jackie's kid. Your best friend's kid.
Well, understand if you want to give him a pass, and I'm sure everybody else will too. Hey, your decision goes the other way. The one thing you cannot do, Ralph, you cannot do, is blame yourself. You took this kid under your wing. You schooled him as best you could. Didn't you?
Jack spoiled him.
I think this is yours. Stupid kid was carrying it around during the holidays.
That's why I'm ordering you to do it. This is all your fault, and you're the only one to blame. There's no getting out of this one. Ralph is outsmarted here, and he knows it. The longer he puts off taking out Jackie Jr., the worse it looks for him. When Tony pulls out the gun that Ralph had given to Jackie, it was sort of mocking Ralph, especially after Tony sarcastically told Ralph he did the best he could to school Jackie Jr. This is Ralph in a nutshell. Smart at times, but outclassed and outmatched in others. And when he's outmatched, he makes some incredibly dumb decisions. Still, at this point, Ralph was valuable to the family, but Tony was constantly looking for ways to find a chink in his armor. Because Tony couldn't stand Ralph and had been wanting to get rid of him for a while, this conversation was just another test for Tony to catch Ralph slipping. So, what can we learn from Ralph? Well, as I said at the beginning of the video, when a person is incredibly talented and valuable, many things become overlooked, such as adherence to rules, standards, or decorum. As long as that person continues to produce, they'll get away with things that others won't. That is, until a certain line is crossed and their drama becomes a bigger detriment than their production value. Let's say you're at work and this person is a coworker. Your best bet is to stay on good terms with them, but don't rely on them for anything. Ralph couldn't keep his mouth shut to save his life, literally. Someone like that needs to be kept at arm's length, but you don't want to completely ostracize them. Remember, in the work world, money talks, and even if you know that person is a complete piece of crap, don't expect anyone to listen to your complaints while that person is producing. It's only after they fall off that people start to bring up how bad they actually were. Bide your time. People like Ralph eventually screw up big time. Another thing to remember about Ralph is his relationship with Tracy changed the dynamic of the entire show. David Chase said that he wrote her assault by Silvio and death by Ralph so violently because he felt audiences were beginning to see the mobsters more as comical or funny rather than the violent sociopaths they were. He also stated that Tony wasn't actually attacking Ralph over Pyomai, but rather taking revenge for Tracy. Let them talk long enough and people like Ralph will eventually show you who they are. Remember, Ralph always started out telling a story that wasn't true just to get himself out of a situation or to make himself look good in front of his friends. Remember, he told his crew unprompted that it was Janice, not him, that liked getting penetrated by a dildo. Well, why would he do that? Well, if word got out later, then he'd be able to deny it and make up an excuse about how she was the jealous one or bitter or something like that. When he was venting to Johnny Sack about Tony, he first talked about how Tracy wasn't his baby mama and she was just a whore, and eventually he tried to blame the murder on the fact that she hit him first. When he realizes Johnny wasn't buying any of that, he finally admits it was the cocaine. There was a person I knew in a previous job that always had a story about something he did. He was one of those guys that always had some tall tale of success and an excuse to match on why things never worked out. I mean, this guy was going to be a Marine, but then he broke his leg. He was almost a superstar race car driver, but that didn't work out for some reason. He was a breakdancer in New York, and at one point, he was a star of some big play back in the day. His stories were just enough to be believable, but still made you raise your eyebrow a bit. You never really did know what to believe. Then one day, out of the blue, he was fired for stealing from the company. I couldn't believe it at first. He seemed like a really stand-up guy who just enjoyed telling ridiculous stories. But when I reflected back on the time we worked together, I started realizing that he wasn't just telling stories, he was living a complete lie. He told people so much BS that he started to believe it himself. Same goes for Ralph. Tony, Johnny, and even Paulie saw through it, and eventually it caught up to Ralph. It always catches up to people like this. A final point about someone like Ralph is, they're usually a good indicator of the culture and status of the organization. Remember, at Gigi's funeral, Tony contemplates the captain vacancy and looks over at the group of possibilities. Vito is sitting like a slob on the bench, Pontecorvo is asleep, and Donnie K is fidgeting like a child with his tie. The only real choice was Ralph. In an earlier scene in which Tony is berating the captains about their poor kick-up to Junior, he gets nothing but excuses and sad looks from guys like Carlo, Albert, and Raymond. He mostly calls out the other three, but not Ralph specifically. It's clear that Ralph is just there because he's a captain and it's a meeting for capos, but it again shows that he's the only one that can really pull his own weight. In an organization where one person is clearly miles ahead of everyone else in terms of production, it's an indicator that the organization will allow that person to get away with more than they would in any other circumstance. The DeMeo crime family was really nothing more than a glorified crew with only one big earner, someone who eventually got so big that another family relied on him. When the rest of the team is that bad, it's almost impossible for the high producer to not have some sort of ego. If you're leading a team like this, remind yourself that no one can be bigger than the team. As an old supervisor told me, it's better to be down a person and have to struggle for a bit than to be held hostage by someone who may or may not cause you serious problems down the road. You can't be afraid to cut someone no matter how bad you think you need them. Production and culture are in equilibrium, and if one person can throw it off, it's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. The thing is, every organization needs and has top performers. It's your job as a leader to lead them correctly and give them lots of personalized attention. High performers are not people you should just leave alone and forget about them because you think since they're good at their job, they don't need you. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's not uncommon to spend a lot of time coaching a struggling employee, but how many times have you or a manager just left a high performer alone because they figured they didn't need any attention? How did that turn out? A high performer is going to require maintenance. Find out what motivates them. People who are high performers typically do well because they want something more. Tony knew Ralph wanted to be captain, and his hesitancy to promote him became an issue. If you have someone you don't want to promote because you're afraid they might do something you don't like, you probably should be asking why they're still with your company. Keeping them down out of spite is only going to make things worse. Ralph Cifaretto was one of my favorite characters because he influenced so many events in the show and exposed the true nature of other characters. He was able to mask his brutality and psychopathic nature just enough to cause major problems for the family. He nearly got Johnny Sack killed, nearly got himself killed multiple times, killed an innocent girl, and then finally did get himself killed, all in the matter of basically a season and a half. Ralph is a warning to be on the watch for those volatile people who cause a lot of chaos in a short amount of time. They may bring you fortune in the short term, but the only thing they leave behind is an eternity of misery.